I mean, there were reports. There were
both
reports
Russia
that
and China have shared intelligence with Iran.
Yeah, shared some intelligence with Iran, which the Iranians had used to target American bases and soldiers in the region.
Good evening. The war in West Asia has, of course, captivated our attention for the last few weeks. I think the start date that everybody is using for this particular phase is February 28, 2026. That is when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated attack on Iran. Of course, the history of this region goes back for many decades, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're using what has transpired, particularly in the last 2 months or so. Why is this conflict so important? Why are we paying attention? And why has Asia society decided to bring this to Kolkata? Of course, simplification of what is going on is always a little risky, but let me at least put this particular, the significance of this region in 4 buckets. First, of course, is the sheer importance of the region in terms of geopolitics and security. We have the 3 major players, United States and Israel, and then Iran, which are in military conflict. We also have 2 other countries which actually have engaged militarily, which is Yemen and Lebanon. And I'll ask my fellow participants to speak a little bit about that. So that's 5. And then, of course, we have Gulf countries, the 6 Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman. So that's already 5 plus 6, that's 11. And then you have countries which are overtly or some covertly supporting what is going on, right? So these are major players like China and Russia, perhaps some countries in Asia like Japan. And of course, then there's one country in our neighborhood, Pakistan, who has found a role for itself. So you can imagine why this region is so important for us to have a clear understanding of what is going on. The second bucket is geoeconomics, the implications for the world economy, Indian economy, regional economy. I think you've all been reading the papers, so you know the importance this region has for energy, crude oil, natural gas, agriculture products, ammonia, urea, chemicals, sulfur used in batteries and electric vehicles, petrochemicals, plastics. I think some of you may be engaged in these industries here in Kolkata. Critical minerals, aluminum and graphite. There have been stories recently that Diet Coke cans are not available anymore because there's a shortage of aluminum. Anyway, that seems to be an elite problem, but there are far more serious problems. And then we have helium, jet fuel, and so on, and the list is very long. Can you imagine that on February 28, 2026, there were 120 ships passing through the Straits of Hormuz every day, of which 50, 60 of these were tankers with petroleum products. By March 4, that number had become 0. And the implications of that is being felt around the world. The third bucket is a changing nature of warfare. You might have seen how drones are being used and missiles and missile shields, and how air warfare has transformed. And then the conflict seems to have now moved into the maritime domain. One country giving a blockade, but another country countering with another blockade. But there's one more aspect in the security domain that we will talk about today, which is the assassination of the Iranian leadership. There have been close to 50 leaders in Iran that have been assassinated in the last 2 years. That's just the number that we know of. And these are not foot soldiers. We are talking about very senior leaders in military and in government. And finally, the fourth bucket is on people. The direct impact on people, of course, in the region, on Iran, in Gulf, but also the impact we feel here in India because our petrol prices might go up, fertilizer prices might go up. And then we have citizens, we have a diaspora in the region, we have seafarers. We don't often talk about the seafarers as much, but we have Indians who are on the merchant vessels which are currently stuck. So these are the 4 areas in which, you can imagine why this area is so sensitive and so important for India. I hope we can use the next 60 minutes or so to decode some of these issues. I don't think we're trying to predict what is going to happen tomorrow. That's a tall order. But we at least want to understand what are the geopolitical implications, the geoeconomic implications, and implications for Indian foreign policy. Akshay said that Kolkata crowd is known to question, argue, and engage. So I hope you will do that when your time comes after 60 minutes. The floor will be open. Please prepare your questions, and you're welcome to ask any of the panelists. What I want to do today first is I'd like Stanley to really bring us up to speed. There's so much happening actually by the hour. Can you take the first few minutes to just bring us up to speed? What is happening with the ceasefire? Is the ceasefire still in place? Are we respecting the ceasefire? Has anything happened today that we should know? Has anything happened in the last hour that we should be aware of? Over to you.
Thanks, Akshay. And thanks to Asia Society for bringing us all together here for this lovely evening. We have a ceasefire, very fragile ceasefire. And I just saw before coming to the dais, I just saw that Trump had left 2 posts today. And in the first one, he was saying that he has ordered to shoot and kill all these small Iranian boats that are approaching the American blockade. And the second thing, he is basically saying the Iranian leadership is divided so that Iran is unable to take his deal. So this is what Trump's narrative. But, the ceasefire is, which the US leader announced on April 8th, it's more or less holding, though both sides are accusing each other of violating it. Because if you look at the past 2 weeks, when the ceasefire was announced, the Pakistanis were mediating it, and Pakistan said that Lebanon was covered. It was part of the ceasefire agreement. But immediately after that, Israel had started bombing, basically stepped up their strikes on Lebanon. So the Iranians, you look at the ceasefire, the announcements made by both Iranians as well as President Trump. And Trump said that the ceasefire would come into force contingent upon Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The Pakistanis said that Lebanon was covered. But in Lebanon, the war was going on. So then the Iranians said that no, they are not going to open the Strait of Hormuz. They still haven't opened the Strait of Hormuz. So this was the first sticking point. But you had a ceasefire.
Keep it a little far away.
So you have a ceasefire last week. It was a limited ceasefire that was announced last week in Lebanon. But then what happened in between, the United States has imposed one more blockade, another blockade on the Iranian ports. So Trump says that all the ships going in and coming from the Iranian ports would be stopped in the Gulf of Oman. So the Iranians said last week, after the Lebanon ceasefire was announced, that Iran would reopen Strait of Hormuz for all commercial traffic. But then Trump said that no. That's fine. I thank you. He said thanks to the Iranians, but he said his blockade would stay in place. But then IRGC Navy says that no, then the Iranians are not going to open the Strait of Hormuz. So see, this is some kind of a game of chicken in the Strait of Hormuz. Both sides are playing. So if you look at the original agreement made on ceasefire on April 8th, the Iranians were supposed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Pakistanis say Lebanon was covered. But then Lebanon, the war continued. Iranians refused to open the Strait of Hormuz. But then Lebanon, a ceasefire was brought into Lebanon. But then by that time, Trump has imposed another blockade. So Strait of Hormuz remains closed. The blockade, the American blockade also remains now. But, this is the darker side. But on the other side, we have, since April 8th, the United States and Israel haven't attacked the Iranians. And the Iranians haven't fired any missiles to the Israelis. So if you look at the ceasefire, that is some kind of holding. But at the same time, there are a lot of challenges. And even the second round of talks have been called off. And there are a lot of outstanding issues as well. So this is where we are standing.
Okay. It seems like everything is still very tentative from what I understand from what you just said. Professor Rajamohan, let me bring you in. Let's start diving a little deeper into some of these areas. First of all, let's start with, for the purpose of this audience, let's go around the world. What is the interest of the United States and Israel in this conflict? What are they trying to achieve?
Okay, just before we go into that question, maybe I'll take the liberty of saying how wonderful it is to be in Calcutta. It's really, every time I come, I've been coming quite often.
I think
it's really
yeah.
to engage the community here. I'm so glad Asia Society is here, trying to get active in Kolkata. In many ways, the idea of Asia is very deeply linked to Calcutta. In fact, there was China, there was Nippon, there was Cathay, there was East Indies, there was India. The idea of Asia in a modern, contemporary sense owes a lot to what happened in Calcutta. The Asiatic Society, William Jones set it up here, 1784. Then you have the expansion of the British Raj from here into surrounding regions of Asia. Much of it was done from here. Then the idea of a political Asia, you have actually 1902, the Japanese cultural historian Okakura Tenshin came here to meet Tagore. So it was two of them who really proclaimed the idea of Asia, how much there was, because each of us had different colonial rulers, the discovery of each other, I mean, in a way, different parts of Asia, and then Tagore's travels through China to Japan to different parts of the world. There again, you had this, the fantastic encounter, from which comes Kalidas Nag and the setting up of the Greater India Society, again that was in Calcutta, which actually began the engagement with Asia in a deeper way. In between, there were another Bengali. I mean, you must mention M.N. Roy. He and Lenin, were the principal organizers of a conference in Baku, Azerbaijan. It was called the Congress of the Peoples of the East. The whole idea was, how do you set the East ablaze with revolutions? So Manavendranath Roy, was in the international Comintern. He was a key actor. And then you have the final idea of political Asia when Jawaharlal Nehru goes to Brussels to attend the Anti-Imperialist Congress, where he meets the Chinese delegation and unveils a sense of how India and China are going to work together in the post-colonial Asia. So in some ways, a lot is linked to this city. So I'm so glad, Inakshi, you brought Asia Society here, and I hope this is a beginning of a beautiful relationship. I think you build it up. So coming to your specific question, on the question of Iran and why Israel and US have this thing, here again, one of the Governor Generals of India, Lord Curzon, before coming to India, he wrote this long travels on horseback through Iran. So he had this great book called Persia and the Persian Question, which he published before coming here. So the connection was a deep one. My sense of looking at, I think it's easy to think of the conflict today between US and Israel and Iran as something that started last year with the bombing on the nuclear issue, and then the renewal of the fighting this year. But I think the story goes back a little deeper. In fact, the very foundation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If you say there are two slogans when they were formed, death to America, death to Israel. Now, we can go into reason why they had the slogans. Because the fight for democracy in Iran against the Shah of Iran was seen as also as a fight against the Americans, because the Shah was so closely tied to the US. And then Shah of Iran was among the two Muslim countries that actually had reasonable relationship with Israel. Actually, Turkey and Iran they had recognized diplomatic relationship with Iran. But the revolutionary Iran framed the relationship with Israel and with the US in fundamentally adversarial terms. Now, what happens in revolutionary states, sitting in Bengal, we know the communists in China, the communists in Russia, come with these great universalist slogans, but end up being normalized, right? Over a period of time when reality starts hitting you, you get to be more pragmatic. But in the case of Iran, that pragmatism has just not happened in a way. It remains a revolutionary state. Since we don't face the heat of the Iranian revolution, we don't see that threat as much here. But if you're living in the Middle East, Iran is not just saying we are an Islamic republic. They're saying we want to export the idea of the Iranian revolution to the rest of the Middle East. In opposition to the Gulf Arab states, in opposition to the secular Arab states, in opposition to the conservative Arab states. So therefore, the claim that they would transform the Middle East, they were more pro-Palestine than the Arabs themselves. They were more radical than the Arabs themselves. They were more Islamic than the Arabs themselves. Once you framed it in these terms, the tension between Iran and the Arab neighbors was a fundamental one, and the West was clearly on the side of the Arabs. So you had at least the war of Iran-Iraq war. The Gulf Arabs turned to Iraq to secure themselves against the Islamic Revolution. Then you had the whole range of continuous wars that have been fought in the region. But the tension between the Gulf Arabs, the Arabs in general, and Iran has never disappeared. And for them, their security, today you see them, actually many of them have normalized relationship with Israel, but they see Israel as less of a threat than Iran is. And in any case, Israel is a step removed while Iran is next door. So I think if you see the structural evolution of the last 47 years, a revolutionary state determined to export an ideology to the rest of the region, and which says fundamentally, I'm going to change the nature of the political systems in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Middle East. Now, this kind of an agenda was bound to get into conflict. And I think then once outside powers intervene in this, it's a bigger mess. So there we are today, a conflict that has evolved to this current situation. And my sense is the Israelis in the last 10 years have framed Iran as a fundamental existential threat. Therefore, ousting the regime of Iran became a core objective for Netanyahu and for Israel. And the Americans were not fully buying into this objective. The Democrats were happy to do a deal, like Obama did. But Trump bought into this Israeli line and says, look, here is an opportunity, let's decimate these guys, and then went in. Of course, these things never happened as planned. So here we are, no regime change yet, but a confrontation that has intensified, that is not just located in the country of Iran or the Gulf of Hormuz, but for the whole world, because as we discover, much of the world's oil still comes from the Gulf. And the control of the sea lanes coming out of Hormuz today threaten the whole world, not just in terms of energy, but Akshay can talk about it. Helium for semiconductors comes from the petrochemical product. Entire world's petrochemical industry. So the dependence on the Gulf is so deep. So where we are is, Iran thinks it can leverage the world's dependence to inflict pain on the US, to force the US to make compromises. US thinks it can use the economic sanctions and the blockade, which I believe Iran gets $500 million of revenue every day from the exports through the Hormuz. So it is, both of them are inflicting pain on the other. And the question is, who has the more capacity to absorb that pain? Endurance, capacity to endure is the issue. But I think we are reaching a point where something is going to give in the coming days, whether it will yield to a resolution. We can go into the details. There is a deal to be made by both sides. The outlines of it are quite clear. But knowing the personalities and the way Trump does business of diplomacy, he makes it much harder for Iran to do it. And therefore, you might have actually not just a regional war, but the scale of the confrontation could actually go global, because Iran is saying it's not going to respect the law of the sea. It's going to go whole hog to force a new situation on the world. So I think we could be heading to a global war, or a total war is the correct word, or we could actually see sense prevailing on both sides to actually do a deal which is really possible.
I have a follow-up. So, of course, we are hearing that there is a 10-point agenda and then there's a 15-point agenda. You know, both the Iranian side and the Americans have put their agenda forward, and I'd like both of you to react to this. Are the Americans really interested in Iran's nuclear program? Or is it their missile program? Or is Trump really catering to his domestic audience? What is it that he really wants to do in the negotiation?
I'm sure Stanley will add more.
Yeah.
You know, Trump, for all his craziness, actually says, I want to make Iran great again. Even as today, 2 days ago. You know, look, there's a business deal to be made. You know, I can take the oil just as I've done to Venezuela. Look, guys, I can run your oil industry, you make money, we'll all be happily live ever after. So one level, he's actually saying, look, there is a political, economic deal possible, and he's not talking about democracy anymore. He's not talking about bringing democracy to Iran. He's saying, look, let's do the Venezuela model. If the new guys want to do a deal, I'm ready to do a deal. Let's move on, finish this nuclear business. So I think that is the framing with which he comes. Between the 10 points and the 15 points, there are basically, you can say, 4 issues. One, how do you organize the freedom of navigation, the terms of navigation in the Hormuz Strait? That has actually become the principal issue. But the original principal issue was the nuclear one, that's the second one. That is, Iran claims a right to enrich uranium, but says, look, I'm not interested in nuclear weapons. This negotiation has been done on again, off again. So there is a way of finessing the issue of Iran's sovereign right to enrich uranium while not doing nuclear weapons. A deal can be done. A third issue is on the missiles, which is a more difficult issue. We've seen in this war how many missiles Iran has produced. Because if Iran gives away the missile arsenal, then it has no deterrence. So therefore, it will be very hard to cut a deal. But even there, I would think it is possible to imagine a regional arms control structure. Finally, the fourth element is really the regional security. That brings us to what I was saying. How does a revolutionary Iran reassure its neighbors that you won't interfere in their internal affairs? Today, what Iran does with Hezbollah, Hamas, and with the Houthis, it has created proxy forces in the region through which it interferes in the internal affairs. Now, we get upset with what Pakistan does with Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? Now, you think of multiplied by 10x what Iran has done in the Middle East. That it has openly arms, supports these groups with ideological, military, economic support. So, can everyone agree to non-interference in the internal affairs, which is the kind of old 101 principle of international affairs? So if you reassure each other, we won't attack you, we won't undermine the Iranian revolution, but Iranian revolution won't undermine the other states. Can you fix the regional security architecture in which we don't need the Americans to stay there and provide security if there are reasonable assurances to each other? So it is doable,
okay.
But the problem is in life, what is possible and what is probable, fundamentally different things.
Stanley, I have a slightly different question given where he's left off. You know, let's deep dive into Iran. And I want you to, by the way, his PhD is on Hezbollah. So I want you to deep dive a little bit. So for context, Iranian GDP is around $300 billion as of today, whatever the public figures are. Now, $300 billion is smaller than the GDP of Maharashtra. In fact, it is smaller than the GDP of Maharashtra, smaller than the GDP of Tamil Nadu, Gujarat. All of these Indian states have a higher GDP than Iran today. It has not more than $30–40 billion left in its foreign exchange reserves, whereas India's foreign exchange reserves are at $690 billion as of today. Look at the scale. Inflation rates in Iran, 45 to 50% inflation. For comparison, at India, we are 2%, 3%, 4%, and even at 4%, it starts to make us nervous because the price of food and everything starts to go up. How does this economy sustain itself has been a question that we've been scholars have asked for a long time. But how long can Iran sustain this conflict? What is at stake for them here?
So, Professor has already explained basically the behavior of the Iranian government, Iranian state over the last 46 years. So if we try to understand, if you try to look at Iran's behavior from Iran's point of view, I'll come to your question about how long Iran can sustain. The quick answer is that Iran has historically shown, much more endurance than other countries because it has been under sanctions for the last 40 plus years. So it absorbs a lot of pain, and that pain creates cycles of protest because in just this year you saw massive protests. In 2019, in 2021, you see these cycles of protests in Iran, which are primarily triggered by the economic crisis. But at the same time, what you witness in Iran is that Iran absorbs this pain and then move on. So that's one thing. So the question here is whether the United States can enhance the economic cost on Iran, thinking that that can influence Iran's behavior or alter Iran's position on the negotiating table. I won't bet on that because if you look at Iran's behavior, if you look at how Iran absorbs, the cost and then respond to these challenges, Iran has always maintained it has consistently maintained its hardline positions. That's one thing. And then if you look at Iran's behavior, you see, when Iran looks at the region, Iran says that yes, it is a revolutionary state, and it supports all these organizations in the region. It supports Hezbollah, it supports Houthis, it supports Hashad al-Shabi in Iraq. Iran looks at these organizations and then see that this is what the Iranians call their forward defense. They are actually interfering with the domestic affairs of all these countries, but Iran sees a region which is completely hostile to its interests. This is the Iranian way of looking at this region. Across the Gulf, you see all these Gulf monarchies which have American bases, and the United States, Iran has declared the United States as its main enemy from 1979 onwards, as well as Israel. And on the other side, the United States and Israel are also treating Iran as its main rival in this region. So Iran supports Palestinians, Iran supports Hamas, also because Hamas, Iran thinks, especially from the 1990s onwards.
For the benefit of the audience, Hamas in Gaza, you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have Houthis in Yemen.
Exactly.
And so on, yeah.
So, Hamas and Hezbollah, Iran supports them also because Iran thinks those are the pressure points on Israel's borders. So Iran also looks at this from a strategic angle, in a hostile region, surrounded by American bases, in a hostile region where you have the United States, the world's most powerful country, as your rival, as an enemy, and you have Israel, which is the most powerful country in the region, as your declared enemy. So Iran thinks that this is how, which is economically weak, as you pointed out, and which is also, if you look at the conventional military might of Iran, which is not that great, So Iran sees that this policy of supporting these groups, and that is one way of ensuring Iran's deterrence. That's how the Iranians look at it. And you look at the economic costs of the sanctions as well as what is happening now. So Iran has, as I said earlier, Iran has historically absorbed these costs. And Iran thinks that, on the one side, it is suffering economically, internally. But at the same time, Iran thinks that it has the capability to enhance the economic costs on the global economy as such. So this is some kind of this is the game both sides are playing. So Iran, the question is who will blink first? If the United States keeps the blockade, and that will definitely enhance the cost because, the inflation is 50-60%. If you look at the food inflation, that's more than 100%. And there is a huge, employment crisis in Iran. IMF and World Bank says that the economy is expected to contract by 6% this year in 2026. So that's huge. But at the same time, Iran thinks that, that's why I believe that it is possible that there could be a deal. Iranians are showing they signal their very hard position. They refuse to send their delegation to Islamabad. But at the same time, they haven't broken the ceasefire. In a sense, they haven't started attacking the Americans. The US seized an Iranian ship, but they didn't respond. IRGC said that they were going to respond militarily. They didn't respond militarily. So the ceasefire is in place, which shows that the Iranians, despite their public posturing of hardline position, they are interested in staying diplomatically engaged with the Americans because the Iranians also want a deal to bring the war to an end so that they will get some kind of economic reprieve, economic relief. That is important for the Iranian side.
And I think it's important to note that about 80 to 90% of Iran's oil actually goes to China. So there is an economic lifeline there, which is very important for the Iranian economy. And of course, the mechanics of that payment has been worked out to ensure that despite the conflict, that those payments could be made. Except, I think, for the last few weeks where the United States has come in and blockaded probably some of those shipments that were headed to China. So I think that how long economically Iran can sustain is probably an open question. You said they have endurance. I'll take your word for it. But even if they can do so economically, I want you to help us understand how does a country operate when 50 or nearly 50 of its leaders have been assassinated. Clearly that has to have an impact when you take out these top 4-star generals and the ministers and the supreme leader and so on.
So even in the June war, 2025, the Iranians lost a host of military leaders. But this time, Khamenei was killed, Shamkhani was killed, and IRGC commander was killed, and the military chief was killed. So if you look at, all the top leaders, most of the top leaders were killed this year. And if you look at Iran's administrative structure before the war began, of course, Khamenei is the supreme leader, and you have the president Pezeshkian, and the three figures, let's say the most powerful, after Khamenei, three prominent figures in Iran's system were Ali Shamkhani, who was the defense council chief, and Ali Larijani, who was the security council chief, and then the speaker, Ghalibaf, Mohammad Baghar Ghalibaf. So Shamkhani is gone. Larijani was killed on March 17th. Khamenei was killed on 28th. So for any dictatorial, presidential-driven system, any system that's built on a cult personality, I think this kind of impacts, will be very difficult to absorb. But if you look at the Iranian system, yes, it is a revolutionary system, but at the same time, it is a very ideologically rooted system. You look at Iran's constitution, you have the supreme leader, and the supreme leader is not directly elected by the public. The supreme leader is appointed by the assembly of experts. But then you have an elected president, you have an elected parliament. But yes, the elections are controlled by the guardianship council. But this is a system that is put in place with clear institutions, and basically the core, what holds it together is this ideology. And the ideology, if you look at the Iranian ideology, of course, it's a Shia political Islam on the one side, and on the other side, basically, it brings some kind of Leninism into theocracy. Because Khomeini famously said, he is asking, this is some kind of a regime that's going to represent the oppressed. But the regime is also guided by the Vilayati Faqih, by the jurisprudence of the clergy. So he brought together social science and political Islam and then built the system. So my point is that when Donald Trump launched this war, I think Trump, you look at the statement Trump made. You were talking about what the Americans were expecting to achieve from this war. You look at the statements both Rubio made before the war began and what Trump made on the day the war began. Rubio clearly stated 4 objectives. They want to destroy the missile capabilities, they want to destroy the nuclear capabilities, they want to stop Iran supporting all these groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, etc., etc. And Rubio also said that he wanted the Iranian regime to change its behavior. He didn't say regime change in his statement, but when Trump made the statement on February 28, he said all the 3 demands, and then he also added that he wanted regime change. He said this is going to be a once-in-a-generation opportunity. He told the Iranians that once we stop, you start taking over the institutions. So clearly Trump expected either the killing of Khamenei. I think that's why they went after Khamenei this time. The killing would either lead to, either spark protests in Iran, or a new crop of leadership would emerge who would be more amenable to the American demands, like what happened in the case of Venezuela. Trump keeps bringing up Venezuela. But you didn't see that happening. Why? Okay. Because this is a deeply structured, ideologically rooted regime.
Let's shift focus to the Gulf, at least the Gulf countries, the 6 Gulf countries. I think many in the audience here are quite familiar with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Oman and so on, most of the Indians tend to travel a lot more for business, tourism, work, and so on. I think it's important to note both the geopolitical implications and the geoeconomic implications in the Gulf. Now, something very interesting has happened in the last 24 hours. UAE has asked the United States for a dollar swap line. Now, a dollar swap line, just to put it simply, is that UAE is asking the United States for it's a little bit like a line of credit, asking for some dollars, obviously indicating that UAE is depleting dollars. It requires more funding. Now, why would UAE do something like that? It is a somewhat rich country, but this option is used because UAE does not want to sell any of its foreign assets. It does not want to sell any of its foreign exchange reserves. But clearly the pressure is on. If you look at the economies of the Gulf, and I always think it's important to take a disaggregated view of the Gulf. The 6 Gulf countries collectively are about 2.5 trillion in GDP. India's GDP is around 4 trillion, right? So this is little more than a half, all the Gulf countries combined. All the Gulf countries combined make up only 2% of the global GDP. But imagine how important the Straits of Hormuz is. 20% of global oil supply, 25% of liquid natural gas, 33% of global fertilizer supply, 50% of global seaborne sulfur trade, 33% of methanol trade, 33% of helium. So obviously this particular region, even though its contribution to global GDP is very little, but it plays an outsized role in the global supply chain. Again, to take a disaggregated view, Saudi Arabia is the largest economy with about 1.3, 1.5 trillion. The second largest is UAE at 600 billion. But all the other 4, which is Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, again, 200 billion or so, 150 billion. Bahrain is $50 billion. Smaller than many of the Indian states. And it may surprise you to learn that Saudi Arabia has actually been running a fiscal deficit, which is their annual budgeting exercise, a fiscal deficit for the last 10 years. So I think it's important to understand that while this region is wealthy on a per capita basis, takes care of its citizens really well, has very good infrastructure, but it can also face economic pressure. And this dollar swap line, which I mentioned, is one example. Of course, in India, we also know that the Gulf is important because we get a lot of investments from their sovereign wealth funds. Abu Dhabi Investment Authority was one of the main anchors in the National Infrastructure Investment Fund that was set up. We have the Qatari investment funds, we have the Saudi Arabia investment funds, all taking equity investments in Reliance and many other companies. So which is why we always look at the Gulf as an important source of capital. All to say that I think we should take a disaggregated view of the Gulf. I also think that the Gulf is somewhat vulnerable to food consumption. 80% of the food that is imported into Gulf comes from outside the straits. So it's not just economics or energy. I mean, if the food doesn't get there, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, above 80% of the food is imported. For Oman and Saudi Arabia, over 50% of the food is imported. So I think these are really important numbers to keep in mind, that it's not like the Gulf can blindly and has a blank check to continue funding or protecting themselves in this thing. They might have to take some kind of an informed decision on how far they can go. But of course, we might be guided by factors beyond geoeconomics, obviously. Professor Rajamohan, given this geoeconomic landscape, that has not stopped the Gulf from playing a central role. Of course, we have seen the attacks come in from Iran. There are some reports that the Gulf has also counter-responded. I don't know if that is true. But what do you think is the Gulf's strategic calculus here? I mean, what role do they want to play? What do you think are their imperatives? How do you think they would like this to end?
You know, it's like if you're a small country sitting next to a big country. It's like our neighbors as well. Like what Stanley was saying, look, Iran said, look, I'm a nice guy, why are you bringing the Americans in? But all your neighbors bring the Chinese or the Americans in order to balance you. It doesn't matter whether you're a nice guy or a bad guy. Balancing is part of it. So what you have is an Iran with 90 million people, historically being the hegemonic power. It claims the Bahrain as its 14th province. It has grabbed, the day UAE was being formed, when the British were setting up the UAE with all the Emirates stitched together, Shah of Iran that time, it doesn't matter whether it's the mullah or the king, went and grabbed the two islands and said, these are mine. So you have actually a deep structural imbalance between the Arab Gulf, which are small, divided, as you said, bunch of small sheikdoms with a lot of money, and then Iran, which is big, ambitious, historically hegemonic in the region. So you can say, look, why the Americans here? If Iran is not hegemonic, there's no need for American bases. Actually, there are no American bases come in well into the 90s. Till then, Americans were largely what was called the over-the-horizon presence rather than on-the-ground presence. But today they have bases everywhere, as you said. Now, will the war make the Gulf less dependent on the Americans or more dependent on them? I would think more dependent. Because Russia and China might be great powers. At this point, they're not in a position to offer security to the Gulf Arabs. So that takes them back to the Americans. But are they caught between a regional hegemon and a distant ally? Of course they are. So they're trapped in that sense. They need a resolution. So if this doesn't work, if Iran doesn't change its policies, or if America remains volatile, you're going to see probably some of them will get even more closer to Israel. Because Israel, as you said, is a powerful country today. Already there's something called the Middle East Air Defense Alliance. So whether they have diplomatic relationship with Israel or not, many of them have actually helped block Iranian missiles from flying into Israel. So it is, I think if you take away the religious cover and think of it structurally, purely only in terms of power, the power imbalance and the logic of balance of power takes the smaller countries, because they can't defend themselves, they turn to the United States. And some of them have turned to Israel as a stronger. That's the meaning of the Abraham.
And when you talk about the power imbalance, you're talking about military and geopolitical power.
Yeah, I mean, see, Iran might not have a military power of the type, but they, as I said, look, their capacity to interfere in the internal affairs. That is far more consequential.
So this is interesting. You're saying one of the results of what is happening is the Arab countries actually becoming closer to Israel, and including getting into further and deeper military agreements. In fact, I think you referred to Arab countries actually intervening and stopping missiles going towards Israel. I think Jordan is one example that I think had done that. Yeah, you're right. We want to get to India, but I think everybody has this question, so let me just ask you, the role of China. Is it an overt role? Is it a covert role? I think it seems to be like an overt role by now, but what is the role that China is playing? I mentioned that, of course, the largest client that Iran has for its oil is actually China. But if the Gulf countries can't get their oil out to China, then that's a problem too. So both for China and Russia, I'd like you to explain what you think their role is.
Basically, look, I think China has huge interests in the Gulf. They have so far focused on the economic and the technological. Their capacity to deliver serious military assistance is limited. There's some speculation, they gave some intelligence to the Iranians to bomb some of the American facilities, like they gave to our Pakistani friends as well. I mean, like that level of assistance. They'll sell some arms, but they can't match the American military power. And that's one of the problems. 10,000 miles away, the United States brings in 3 aircraft carriers, 50,000 troops, bombing the hell out of this country. China can sit and watch. It is not in a power Russia. They might be great powers. They don't have the military power or the capacity for force projection, what in military terms we call long legs. They don't have the long legs to reach. So they're sitting and watching, hoping like hell Americans will make more mistakes. And they had no choice but to watch in Venezuela, where one of the closest friends of Russia and China is turned around by the Americans. If they do something like that in Iran, it will be a big setback for China and Russia. But the problem in the near term is they also need the oil supplies. In fact, if you see the joint Pak-China peace plan, one of the important steps was, look, open the Hormuz Strait. And one of the things China continuously says, there must be a mechanism for ensuring freedom of navigation in the Gulf, which is also our position, which is also position of most countries. So they're trapped actually. They see awesome American military power being deployed. But they also hope Trump, the maverick, will actually undermine himself. So for them is bide your time, wait, rather than their ability to intervene is significantly limited.
Stanley, there are other major powers too. Which other major powers beyond China and Russia? You know, there's Europe, there is the United Kingdom held a meeting trying to see if they could play a role in Straits of Hormuz, Japan. Which are the other major powers that you think are playing a role?
No. If you look at these countries' dependence on the Strait of Hormuz, oil and gas, the oil and gas coming out of the Persian Gulf, almost all countries have taken it, including us. But Europe, the UK, I don't think they are major players in what is happening in this region. Of course, the UK has issued statements saying that they would want to see Strait of Hormuz being opened, and Europe had also issued similar statements. But I don't think that they can do anything to influence what is happening, what is unfolding in this region. They are not. They are sitting away, but at the same time, they have an interest to see that the Strait of Hormuz being opened or the conflict, being resolved. But Russia and China, yes. If you are a Russian, when the Russians look at the region, when the Russians look at West Asia, they have seen back-to-back strategic setbacks in this region, right? They had very close ties with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The government collapsed in November 2024. And then Iran is perhaps the last remaining major state-level partner for the Russians have in this region. And the war, from an economic point of view, is also a reprieve for the Russians, because this is the second month the Trump administration has extended the waiver on the Russian oil. So, a couple of months ago, if you were buying the Russian oil, you are a problem. But now you need to buy the Russian oil, right? Even the Indians have also stepped up buying Russian oil because there is a waiver. So Putin, he might be making more money. Some kind of, at least some economic pressure is off the Russian economy. And also there were reports that the Russians had shared intelligence with the Iranians to target the American soldiers. Why? Because Iran, both the Russians and the Chinese.
I think you both have said that both China and Russia have shared some intelligence. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, there were reports.
Both Russia and China have shared intelligence with Iran.
Yeah, shared some intelligence with Iran, which the Iranians had used to target American bases and soldiers in the region. So, when the Russians look at the region, what they want is that they don't want the current Iranian government to fall, because that doesn't serve their interest. And they would also like to see the Americans getting stuck in the region at least for some time, so that would provide them some reprieve. In the case of China, I think as Professor had mentioned, China has, on the one side, yes, you have this larger geopolitical competition, global geopolitical competition with the United States, but on the other side, China is also heavily dependent on oil and gas coming out of this region. So the Chinese have a special interest in seeing at least the Strait of Hormuz being reopened. So China has, mixed interests here. But whereas I think the Russians are not in a hurry to see the situation being resolved. At least they are not facing the heat as of now.
Okay. I saw a report recently which said that Russia actually might see an increase in the oil revenues it gets as a result of this, because as the price of oil goes up and more countries are allowed to buy Russian oil, the Ukrainians are worried that the higher purchase and the high price of oil actually brings windfall revenue to the Russians. So, you know, it's a geopolitical chessboard, a lot of moving pieces. But you reminded us, Stanley, that the waiver, the Americans had given us a 1-month waiver to buy oil from Russia. That has been extended by another 30 days, I think, on April 7th. So we have until May 7th. Let's move the discussion to India, and we'll finish with India. Professor Rajmohan, Pakistan playing an important role, it's seemingly. China playing an important role. These are all our neighbors. What are the foreign policy implications for India?
No, I think, you know, Pakistan is always, of course, gets all our vote every time they do something. But I don't think we should really be too much worried about what Pakistan is doing. Look, I think for 4 years during Biden administration, Pakistan was completely ignored. I think they've tried very hard that when Trump came back, they needed some access. So I think in a way, they've done some clever diplomacy to get back into the good books of Trump. So that has given them some advantage. But does that translate into concrete outcomes? I don't really know. For example, Pakistan still needs $2 billion from Saudis to roll over their debt. They're still going around seeking, you know, 1 billion here, 2 billion there, to keep their economy afloat. Second, you saw last 2 days, the Iranians have been upset with the Pakistanis. They've been trying to play on the American side, sounding like mediators, but actually you are a one-sided party, telling the Iranians be flexible, show up, because that's what Trump wants. So I think it's not a happy situation to be in. And I would think actually America is getting more out of Pakistan than Pakistan is getting something out of the US. So far the deals that the Pakistan has made with the US, they've all been beneficial to the US. Crypto deal, access to the Recordic mine, which has got a lot of critical minerals, and the Roosevelt Hotel in New York. Trump's family has bought that property and said, look, so you have actually a Pakistan giving things to come back into the limelight. So they got some diplomatic gains, but structurally Pakistan is still stuck at $400 billion GDP, has not grown in the last 5 years. Its per capita income today is below $2,000, less than Bangladesh's. So it's in a very bad economic shape. But then for the army chief, it doesn't really matter. For him, cultivating Trump was very important to keep Imran Khan where he is. In fact, 1 year ago, Pakistani, what are they called? NRPs, non-resident Pakistanis, were mounting a big campaign to get Trump to focus on Imran Khan and get him out of the jail. I think Munir has turned it around. So now Trump doesn't open his mouth on Imran Khan. There was a point when he said, Imran, the handsome athlete, Imran, great guy, I like him, to one where actually he's now says that my favorite field marshal. So in a way, Pakistan has gained some things, but structurally, I don't see them gaining very much economically or strategically for the longer term.
I think that for us in India, you know, most of us are actually more concerned probably on the economic implications, because we can sense that perhaps the petrol prices are going to go up, or the urea prices are likely to go up, and so on. You know, the Indian crude basket, you know, we track oil prices in Brent terms, which is what you see every day, but the Indian crude basket is made up of different prices because we source our oil from different regions. That price had crossed $150 per barrel in March. That's a very big number for a country that has been used to getting our oil at about $60, $70 a barrel. So of course it's going to put a strain on our resources going forward. Perhaps good thing is that coal is still 55 to 60% of our mix, so it generates 70 to 80% of our electricity. So I think on electricity we are okay. We'll have to wait and see what happens to energy, petroleum particularly. And by the way, in the petroleum discussion, I think what often gets lost is not just that we have to import, we have a problem importing crude oil. That's a problem because we of course need oil, but we also cannot export the refined petroleum. The export of refined petroleum from India back to the Gulf and other countries around the world is a very important component of our exports. All of this is now coming to bear because you can see reports of the pressure mounting on the rupee Since the Russia-Ukraine conflict has happened, the rupee has depreciated about 20-25%. Since 2023, when the attack between Gaza and Israel happened, depreciated about 10%. In the last month alone, about 4%. So clearly there is a pressure on the rupee. The Reserve Bank of India has put in several measures, starting with trying to restrict the trading of the rupee that takes place outside our borders, particularly Singapore, so that there is less speculation. There's lots of other micro measures that Reserve Bank of India has taken. There's been a recent announcement just a few hours ago that the Reserve Bank of India is actually going to sell bonds. The government is selling bonds, about 30-40,000 crores. So of course we will have to plan ahead. Our foreign institutional investments have been leaving the country. We lost about $18 to $20 billion last year. Our FDI is about plateaued at about 1 billion net. So we have, foreign capital is a concern. We have to find ways to get capital, and that will continue to put some pressure. The fertilizer and urea is also very important because the Kharif season is coming up, the monsoon sowing. And it seems what the government has said is that we have enough stock for the Kharif season, but even if we do, the Rabi season will come in the winter, and so we need enough urea and fertilizer, and we are really dependent on the Gulf on all those products. So I think that supply disruptions is a very important concern, and we can get into it a little bit more in the Q&A. The government has actually come out with a slew of measures. The Ministry of Shipping has come out with measures related to our shipping and ensuring ships that can actually go to Iran. The Chemicals and Fertilizer Ministry has come out with its own regulations. Ministry of External Affairs is working and has come out with its own initiatives. So a lot is going on.